Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. There's something strange about pain. Everyone fears it, avoids it, spends a lifetime insulating from it. But what if suffering wasn't the enemy? What if pain was not only unavoidable but vital? What if every moment of agony carved something important into the soul? This is a story about suffering and why the greatest minds in history believed it was not a curse but a hidden teacher. If that already sounds absurd, stay. There's something quiet and powerful beneath this idea, and by the end of tonight's journey, it might just change how suffering is seen forever. If you find this story meaningful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. We post every single day, so there's always something new to fall asleep to. And while you're here, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Are you watching at midnight or 3:33 a.m. again? Somewhere in the pages of history, long before antidepressants and positive affirmations, a man named Job sat on a pile of ashes, scraping the sores from his skin with a shard of broken pottery. Everything was gone: his livestock, his health, his children, his reputation, a righteous man who lost everything. In the biblical tale, Job doesn't suffer because he was weak or wicked. He suffers because he was good. And for millennia, this has troubled believers and thinkers alike. Why does goodness not shield us from pain? Why do the most faithful sometimes suffer most profoundly? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe suffering isn't a punishment. Maybe it's a portal. Schopenhauer, the famously bleak philosopher, didn't just tolerate suffering. He saw it as the raw material of the world. To him, existence was rooted in a blind, endless force called will, a cosmic hunger that drives all life to strive, to desire, and inevitably to suffer. In his words, all life is suffering, not because the universe is cruel, but because desire itself is a trap. The moment a creature wants something, it begins to hurt. And once it gets what it wants, it grows bored. So it begins to want again. And on the pain repeats. Suffering is not an exception to life. It is life. The Buddha said something eerily similar. He called it dukkha, not just pain, but the fundamental unsatisfactoriness of existence. Even joy contains a bitter seed, because it cannot last. Even comfort rots with time. Everything slips. Everything decays. So the goal was not to avoid suffering, but to understand it, to watch it without clinging, to see through the illusion of permanent satisfaction. Epictetus, the Stoic slave turned sage, went further. He said, "We suffer not from the events in our lives, but from our judgments about them." Fire cannot burn the soul, he believed. Poverty cannot ruin the wise. If suffering can be endured, then it is endurable. If it cannot, then it will soon end. Either way, the mind remains free. But how? How can a human being train their spirit to endure the unbearable? Viktor Frankl, imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, watched everything stripped from men, family, freedom, future, and still noticed a strange truth. Those who survived were not always the strongest, but the ones who found meaning in their pain, meaning even in horror. One man gave away his last bread. Another whispered poetry through barbed wire. Another dreamed of rebuilding the world. Frankl called this the last freedom, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. And so suffering becomes not just a test, but a forge. Like steel hammered in fire. The worst thing that happens might also be the thing that forms a soul. But there's another layer, a more terrifying one. Albert Camus stared into the absurd. He didn't see order or will or punishment. He saw chaos, randomness, a universe that does not answer. To Camus, the real horror is not that life hurts. It's that it hurts for no reason. A child dies, a good man starves, a woman is loved then forgotten. No cosmic justice, no script, just silence. So what then? Why live? Camus answered with rebellion. With defiance. He said the absurd man is not one who gives up, but one who lives without appeal, who stares into the void and keeps walking, who finds joy not in meaning, but in the act of choosing to live anyway. Sisyphus rolls his stone not because he must, but because he chooses. And in that choice, he is free. What a strange thing, that the key to peace might lie in surrender, not escape, that the answer to suffering might not be to avoid it, but to face it until it breaks, until something deeper is revealed beneath it. The Stoics trained for this. They practiced loss, imagined death, slept on the floor, wore rough clothing, not because they hated life, but because they wanted to be ready when life inevitably changed. They knew that comfort weakens the soul, that ease softens the will, that the untrained mind breaks easily. So they rehearsed suffering, and in doing so, they became unshakable. Today, we're told the opposite. That pain is failure. That discomfort means something's wrong. But maybe the wrong thing is the story itself. Maybe suffering isn't a glitch. Maybe it's the initiation, the sharpening, the shadow that reveals light. There is something sacred in surviving, something ancient, something no machine can imitate. Pain creates depth. Loss creates wisdom. Stillness creates sight. All of it matters, even the parts that don't make sense yet. So tonight, if there's something hurting, maybe don't push it away, maybe listen, maybe sit with it, gently, like an old friend returned from far away. It has something to say, something only the dark can teach. Suffering, when seen without its disguise, is rarely loud. It creeps in, slow, quiet, like fog sliding through the cracks of a window that was left ajar. And often the greatest transformations do not begin with a scream, but with a silence that becomes unbearable. Consider the Roman Stoic Seneca, exiled by the emperor, stripped of his power, accused falsely, and left to rot in isolation. His writings in exile were not bitter. They were calm, almost disturbingly serene. He wrote, "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials." He did not write that as a theory. He wrote it as someone breaking and rebuilding in the dark. Seneca believed the universe sends hardship not as punishment, but as practice. And yet, to most people, pain still feels like a mistake. Modernity has taught that pain should be cured, that discomfort must be eliminated, that the ideal life is one of endless ease and uninterrupted pleasure. But deep down, every ancient culture, every spiritual tradition whispered a darker wisdom. That pain is the price of growth, that the soul is a blade and pressure sharpens it. In Buddhism, the image of the lotus flower is no accident. It blooms only in muddy water. The dirtier the pond, the stronger its stem. No mud, no blossom. And in psychology, Carl Jung observed something haunting. He wrote that no tree can reach to heaven unless its roots reach to hell. That the descent into suffering is not an aberration, but a requirement. Jung saw pain as the shadow of the self, the part that most avoid, but to ignore it is to remain fragmented. Healing, he believed, begins not by escaping pain, but by integrating it. The unloved part, the failure, the shame, the rage. To become whole is not to be perfect, but to walk willingly into the storm within and light a candle there. What happens to a person who refuses this descent, who builds a life out of avoidance? Often they look successful, comfortable, smiling, but something is missing in their eyes, a kind of hollowness, a light that never came because the darkness was never faced. Pain does not go away when ignored. It mutates, becomes cynicism, numbness, projection, addiction, control. The most wounded people often don't cry. They micromanage. They manipulate. They chase validation like air. Because the wound is still speaking, but no one is listening. And yet, the moment someone sits with it, truly sits, without fixing, without fleeing, a quiet shift begins, a softening, a remembering. Sometimes the pain becomes the teacher it always wanted to be. There's a reason soldiers return from war unable to explain what they saw. Pain that deep warps language. It carves new corridors into the psyche, and it changes values. What once mattered becomes ridiculous. What once seemed unbearable becomes light. There's a phrase used by trauma survivors. It broke me, but it built me. Not because suffering is inherently noble, but because surviving it forces clarity. It wipes the illusions away. It shows what remains when everything else is gone. Friedrich Nietzsche knew this intimately. To live is to suffer, he said. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. Nietzsche's own life was a long scream beneath quiet papers. He lost his father at age 5. He lived in chronic pain, was misunderstood, rejected, and ultimately went mad. And still, he wrote of eternal recurrence. He imagined a demon whispering in your ear, "You must live this life again and again and again in every detail with no change." Would that be a curse or a gift? The answer reveals everything. If a person cannot bear the idea of repeating their life infinitely, perhaps something needs to change. Not the life, the self. Nietzsche did not glorify suffering. He weaponized it, turned it into a mirror, an acid that burns away pretense, and in its place, a stronger self might emerge. One that does not break, but bends. One that loves its fate. Amor fati, the love of fate. To bless even the worst day, because it shaped the current one. But this is not taught in schools. It is not sung in pop songs. Today, suffering is pathologized, seen as a defect, a glitch, something to be corrected. But what if the deepest pain was not a sign of something wrong, but a message from the part of the self that refuses to die silently? There are people who smile while grieving, who make art from heartbreak, who laugh at funerals not from disrespect, but from reverence for how brief, how brutally beautiful it all is. These people have passed through the fire. They do not need constant joy to feel alive. They have learned the secret, that wholeness is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of truth. And truth is sharp, but also freeing, because once a person sees their own darkness and does not run from it, no one else can use it against them. That is the quiet power of suffering. It humbles, it strips, it shows who is real. And for those willing to endure, it transforms. Like coal to diamond, like silence to music. Suffering does not always end with answers. Sometimes it ends with a new kind of strength, the kind that looks like stillness. That sounds like silence, that feels like peace. Not because the pain is gone, but because it no longer owns the mind. And yet, even as suffering is elevated into something sacred, something transformative, it must not be romanticized blindly. Pain has teeth, it mauls, it cripples, it swallows entire years without warning. To speak of suffering as a teacher is not to say it is kind. It isn't. It is ruthless, arbitrary, indifferent. But so is nature, so is time, so is gravity. The wisdom is not in what pain is, but in what we choose to do with it. There are those who drown inside it, and there are those who learn to breathe underwater. What makes the difference? Sometimes it's luck. Sometimes it's biology. But often it's the stories whispered in the dark, the beliefs built in the quiet, hidden places. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a practice called Tonglen, a kind of meditation that sounds almost insane in the modern world. Breathe in the suffering of others, they say. Don't avoid it, don't block it, breathe it in, let it enter the heart. And as you exhale, imagine sending out relief, compassion, light. It is the reversal of instinct. Instead of resisting pain, embrace it, transform it, share in the burden. This isn't metaphor, it is practice. And people who do it say something begins to shift. A sense of separation dissolves. A soft, painful unity emerges. Because suffering isolates. It tells the lie of uniqueness. No one else understands, no one else has felt this. But the truth is that everyone is bleeding somewhere. Everyone is carrying something invisible. And those who've suffered deeply tend to recognize each other without speaking. a kind of silent fellowship, a knowing glance, a quiet shared flame. It's why trauma survivors often feel more connected to each other than to anyone else. They've seen behind the curtain, touched the wire. They know how thin the veil really is between safety and chaos. And once that illusion breaks, something essential is revealed. That nothing is guaranteed. That control is a story we tell ourselves. And that the only real peace comes from surrendering to the instability, rather than fighting it. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, wrote his meditations not as proclamations, but as reminders. Soft, steady reminders to himself that he would die, that his children might die, that praise and insult are both wind, that the only thing he controls is his own mind. And so he rehearsed suffering daily, not to be morbid, but to be free. If loss is expected, it cannot unmake you. If pain is not feared, it cannot enslave you. Aurelius ruled an empire, but he spoke to himself like a monk, because he understood that real power does not mean avoiding suffering. It means carrying it without becoming bitter. A sword that does not rust, a heart that does not harden. In our time, we seek comfort as if it were a right, as if a life without pain is something owed. But comfort, over time, becomes a prison. It makes us fragile, makes us flinch at shadows. It tells us that anything unpleasant is a problem. But the ancient world knew better. They saw storms as necessary, fire as purifying, trials as sacred. Even today, across cultures, rites of passage often include suffering, isolation, hunger, fear. The purpose is not cruelty, it is transformation. Something must be stripped away for something deeper to emerge. And yet in the West, we avoid all of it. We anesthetize grief. We pathologize sadness. We run from the truth that life is, at its core, impermanent and unpredictable. But pretending it isn't does not make it safer. It makes it more dangerous. Because when suffering inevitably arrives, we are unprepared, and an unprepared soul is a fragile one. This is why philosophy matters, not as abstraction but as armor, as medicine, as map. It cannot remove the storm, but it can steady the hand holding the sail. And sometimes, that's enough. Consider Epictetus again. Born a slave, crippled by his master. He said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react that matters." He lost everything a man can lose, and yet he became a guide for emperors. Not because he avoided pain, but because he met it fully and emerged whole. Even joyful, that's the word that confuses most. Joy in suffering, but joy is not the same as pleasure. Pleasure is shallow. Dependent, joy is deeper. It often blooms in the worst places. A laugh at a funeral, a smile through tears. The moment a cancer patient watches the sun rise and feels grateful just to be. These are not contradictions, they are revelations. That light is not the absence of dark, but its twin. That to feel deeply is to live fully, and that a life without suffering would be like a symphony with no bass notes. All sparkle, no weight, no contrast, no depth. We need the dark to appreciate the flicker of the candle, and maybe that's the point. Not to suffer endlessly, but to stop running from it, to stop pretending that it doesn't belong. Because it does. It has always been here. Since birth, since breath. Suffering is not a detour. It's the path itself. The test is not to avoid it, but to walk through it and still sing. Still build, still love, even with broken hands. There is a strange kind of honesty that comes only from pain. It peels away the costumes people wear. No more pretending, no more roles. A person in suffering cannot maintain the lie for long. The mask slips, and when it does, something raw is revealed. Something terrifying, but also strangely beautiful. The truth. And perhaps that is why suffering is sacred to philosophers, mystics, and survivors alike. Not because it is enjoyable, but because it is real. In a world flooded with illusion, pain does not lie. It does not flatter. It does not negotiate. It simply arrives and waits to be faced. And that confrontation, that quiet, agonizing confrontation, is where the self is stripped bare. In Hindu philosophy, there is a goddess named Kali. She's not soft. She wears a necklace of skulls and dances on the corpses of demons. She is destruction. She is fear. She is the Dark Mother. But those who understand her know she is not evil. She is necessary. She destroys only what must be destroyed. Illusion, ego, attachment. And through her chaos, something clearer is born. Liberation. Pain in this way becomes a cleansing fire. Not pleasant, not merciful, but purifying. It's a recurring pattern. Across cultures, time and continents, the same image repeats. Fire that refines, storm that renews, death that gives way to life. Even in nature, this is true. Some forests will not grow unless they first burn. Certain seeds only sprout after fire cracks them open. Without destruction, no regeneration. Without decay, no blossom. Pain is not separate from life. It is the compost. And yet, the modern mind recoils. It wants anesthesia, numbness, comfort without cost. But when the soul is deprived of challenge, it withers. Like a muscle never used, like soil never turned. The most haunting lives are often not the most tragic. They are the ones filled with silent longing, comfort without meaning, safety without purpose, a slow erosion of aliveness. And it begins when suffering is seen only as a flaw, a defect, something to be corrected instead of contemplated. There's a Japanese concept called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, they're filled with shimmering resin. The object is not made to look new again. It is made to look whole. And in that wholeness, the break becomes part of its identity. Not a wound, a vein of gold. Imagine if people were seen this way. Not as broken things to be fixed, but as vessels made beautiful by survival. What would the world look like if the visible marks of pain were honoured, not erased? If the scar was not a shame, but a signature? A story of endurance written in the body. Some say this is what real maturity is. Not the absence of emotion, not perfect control, but the ability to carry grief like a lantern, to walk with it quietly, not to be consumed by it, not to run from it, but to live alongside it, and in doing so, to become someone others can lean on. Not because they're untouched, but because they have been through the fire and are still here, stronger, softer, real. This is what Camus meant when he said, "In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer." He did not mean optimism. He meant defiance. He meant that even when everything collapses, there is something inside that refuses to be extinguished. That something cannot be taught in school. It must be forged, and suffering is the fire. Even children know this instinctively. A scraped knee teaches limits. A lost pet teaches love. A broken friendship teaches truth. The world reveals itself through contrast. Pleasure without pain is invisible. Light without dark is blinding. The soul needs both. That's why those who have suffered often speak slower. Pause more, feel deeper. They don't rush to fill silence. They've learned that silence holds things: pain, memory, insight. Silence becomes sacred after suffering, because in it the echoes return. The lessons whispered, not shouted. Most people miss them, because they're busy drowning it out. But if one listens, the suffering starts to speak. Not in words, but in symbols, images, feelings. And suddenly, one understands things that were once unreachable. The pain becomes a kind of translation, a way of seeing differently, feeling more fully, responding more wisely. This doesn't mean one becomes perfect, far from it. Suffering doesn't always make people kinder. Sometimes it hardens them, makes them suspicious, defensive. But if it is faced with openness, if it is allowed to move through rather than calcify, then something else emerges. Compassion, depth, presence, a strange kind of gentleness that comes only from knowing what it means to be undone, and to keep living anyway. The world is full of this quiet strength, the mother who holds her crying child through sleepless nights, the elder who buries their partner and still tends the garden, the friend who listens without offering advice. These are not grand gestures, but they are sacred, they are forged by suffering, made possible by it, because once a person has been broken, they understand the fragility of others. And with that comes reverence, with that comes care, not pity, not condescension, but deep, aching care. And that is something the world desperately needs, not more strength, but more softness from those who are strong. Suffering teaches this, if one is willing to learn. But even with all the insight that suffering can bring, there's something deeply human about wanting to escape it, to hide from it, to deny it. It's built into the nervous system. Pain means danger. Avoidance means survival. And yet, when that same instinct is applied to emotional or existential pain, it begins to backfire. The more one avoids it, the louder it becomes. The more it is repressed, the more it leaks through in other forms: anxiety, insomnia, restlessness, numbness. The body becomes a cage for everything unsaid, everything unfelt, everything unhealed. And slowly, the person forgets what peace even feels like. They laugh, but the laughter feels hollow. They rest, but it brings no relief. Because pain, when buried, doesn't dissolve. It grows roots. It becomes the lens through which everything is seen. Every conversation becomes coloured by suspicion. Every silence feels like abandonment. Every compliment feels like a setup. This is the quiet tyranny of unprocessed pain, and it spreads slowly, silently, until it shapes identity. The person doesn't just feel pain, they become it. But there is another way, and it begins with something small: stillness. The decision to stop running, to stop avoiding, to sit with the discomfort and let it speak, to stop demanding it go away and instead ask it what it wants to reveal. This is not easy. In fact, it's one of the hardest things a person can do, because it means reopening the wound, facing what was once unbearable. But pain is strange. When it is resisted, it grows stronger. When it is welcomed, it begins to soften. It begins to unravel, like a knot that has been pulled tight for years and finally begins to loosen. Often what it reveals is not what was expected, not weakness, not defect, but grief, the quiet kind, the kind that has no name, no story, only a weight, the grief of unlived life, of swallowed words, of years spent performing instead of being. This is not dramatic pain. It is the pain of subtle misalignment, of pretending to be okay for too long. And once it is felt, truly felt, a strange thing happens. The fear begins to fade, because the person realizes they can survive it. The monster under the bed was never as powerful as the fear of it, and in that realization something ancient awakens. The self, not the persona, not the mask, but the thing beneath, the thing that watches, that feels, that has always been there, waiting to be remembered. And in that remembering, suffering begins to change shape. It becomes less of a threat and more of a companion, still heavy, still hard, but no longer the enemy. More like a stern guide, a teacher with rough hands and kind eyes. It is not there to destroy, but to refine, to burn away what no longer serves, to show what was always real. Many who walk this path speak of a strange paradox, that even in the depths of pain, there can be peace, not because the pain is gone, but because resistance is. The waves still crash, but the drowning stops. The person learns to float, to breathe underwater, and suddenly, what was once unbearable becomes manageable. Not easy, but possible, and that is everything. Because when suffering is no longer seen as a mistake, the entire meaning of life begins to shift. Success no longer means comfort. It means alignment, integrity, living in a way that doesn't abandon the self. Joy no longer means stimulation. It means presence, stillness, connection, even with the hard things, especially with the hard things. And slowly, the life that once felt hollow begins to fill. Not with constant happiness, but with truth, with depth, with moments that matter. Real moments. And perhaps that is the gift of suffering. It forces one to stop skating on the surface. It demands depth, demands presence. It is not polite, not convenient, but it is honest. And in a world built on noise, distraction, and performance, that honesty is rare. It is medicine, but like most medicine, it tastes bitter at first. The ego resists, the mind argues, but the soul recognizes it, welcomes it, because the soul knows what the mind forgets, that suffering, when faced, when integrated, becomes strength. Not the brittle kind that needs to dominate, but the quiet kind that endures, the kind that cannot be faked, that cannot be bought, that shines through the eyes in moments of crisis, that holds steady when everything else falls apart, that whispers, "You've been through worse, you'll survive this too." And this kind of strength is contagious. Others feel it. They lean toward it, not because it is flashy, but because it is real. It is safe. And in a world full of masks, realness is magnetic. This is why those who have truly suffered often become the most trusted, the most grounded, the most wise, not because they have all the answers, but because they are not afraid of the questions, not afraid of the dark. They've walked through it, and they've come back with something worth sharing. And still, even after all the lessons, all the insights, there remains a strange, quiet question lodged in the back of the mind, like a sliver beneath skin. What if it was all for nothing? What if the suffering didn't make us stronger, didn't make us wiser, didn't purify or deepen or transform? What if it just hurt? That doubt lingers. It haunts the sleepless hours. And yet, maybe that is part of the truth too. Maybe suffering isn't guaranteed to teach anything. Maybe the pain only becomes useful when we choose to engage it, when we stop turning away and begin to ask it real questions, listen to its strange language, trace its outlines with steady hands. Because unexamined pain is just suffering. But examined pain becomes alchemy. It begins to change form, to reveal patterns, and those patterns are personal, unique, like fingerprints of the soul. One person's suffering might harden them, another's might soften them, and sometimes the same person is both, hard and soft, bitter and wise, angry and awake. There is no formula, only experience, only the raw, messy process of becoming. And that process never ends. It's not like crossing a finish line. It's more like tending a fire. Some nights the flame is strong. Other nights, it almost goes out. But still, the hands return to it. Feed it, shelter it, wait with it. And that waiting is everything. Because the modern world is impatient. It wants instant healing. Quick fixes, happy endings wrapped in clean bows. But the psyche doesn't work that way. The soul doesn't respond to force. It responds to presence, to stillness, to honesty. It responds when it is no longer being rushed. And suffering, for all its cruelty, often becomes the one thing that slows a person down long enough to hear themselves again, to feel, to see clearly. There are no guarantees, no promises, but there is the possibility. And sometimes, possibility is enough. Consider the lives of those who came before, the artists, the poets, the thinkers whose legacies we still quote in midnight notebooks and broken-hearted mornings. Most of them were not spared pain. Many of them lived surrounded by it. Kafka, sickly and isolated, pouring his alienation into pages that now feel like prophecy. Van Gogh, spiraling through madness, painting the stars brighter than anyone else ever had. Sylvia Plath, clawing her way through depression, leaving behind words that still echo. These were not happy people in the conventional sense, but they felt deeply. They translated suffering into language, into colour, into something that could be shared. And in that sharing, they made the world a little less lonely. That is another quiet truth about suffering. It connects, not just in empathy, but in expression. The poem that feels like it was written just for one reader. the song that says exactly what someone cannot, the film that cracks something open. These are not coincidences. They are transmissions from others who have suffered and chosen to speak. And in speaking, they gave shape to the shapeless. Pain becomes bearable when it has form, when it has language, even if the words aren't perfect, even if the sentences break. The act of expressing it is part of the healing. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Suffering often begins in the unconscious, but the moment it is spoken, drawn, danced, whispered, it begins to move. It begins to release its grip. Not all at once, not forever, but enough to breathe again, enough to take the next step. This is the work. Not to eliminate suffering, but to build a capacity to hold it, to carry it like a sacred burden. Not with martyrdom, but with quiet dignity. Like the monks who walk through war zones in orange robes. Like the grandmother who still bakes bread the morning after the funeral. Like the man who smiles through his tears as he tells a story that still hurts. These moments matter. They are not small. They are the fabric of resilience. The evidence that pain does not have the final word. That something in the human spirit persists, not through power, but through grace, through endurance, through presence. And maybe that is what the ancient philosophers meant when they spoke of virtue. Not perfection, not moral superiority, but the steady return to the self, the refusal to abandon the soul even in darkness, especially in darkness, because anyone can love when it's easy, anyone can speak when the words come fast, but to stay gentle in grief, to stay open in fear, to stay kind in pain, this is rare, this is powerful, and this is the kind of strength suffering can shape, if we let it, if we listen, if we sit with it long enough to understand its rhythm. Because even pain has rhythm. It rises and falls, it crashes and recedes, and in between those waves, there is space, and in that space, something grows. Not loudly, not instantly, but steadily, quietly, like a tree growing under moonlight, like breath returning after sobs, like peace waiting patiently just beyond the edge of fear. And still after all the waves and all the wreckage, there comes a point where suffering no longer feels like an intruder. It becomes part of the architecture, woven into the beams, pressed into the walls. The house still stands, but it hums differently. It creaks in storms. It remembers. And maybe that's the strangest part. How pain can become familiar. How the body adapts to even the sharpest edges until they feel like home. This isn't weakness, it's survival. The nervous system learns, the heart adjusts, and over time, the presence of pain no longer means collapse. It just means breath. One more breath, then another, and eventually, movement. There's a concept in Japanese culture called gaman. It means enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. It's not loud, it's not celebrated, it's the strength that stays quiet, the kind that never asks for applause. And perhaps that's the most powerful kind, the invisible resilience, the kind that gets up every morning, puts on shoes, and walks forward even when the future is a fog. It's not pretty, it's not cinematic, but it's real, and it's everywhere. In the eyes of the exhausted nurse who keeps showing up, in the voice of the parent whispering lullabies while holding back tears, in the hands of the artist painting what they cannot say. These are the carriers of pain, and they're also the carriers of wisdom. Because suffering, when metabolized, turns into something deeper than knowledge. It becomes understanding, not just of one's own sorrow, but of everyone's. It erodes judgment, it softens cruelty, it reminds the self that everyone is fighting a battle unseen. And from that place, compassion is born. Not the sentimental kind, not pity, but the kind that sits beside someone in silence and doesn't try to fix them. The kind that holds space, that listens, that understands without needing to explain. This is rare, but it's also how healing begins, not through solutions, but through presence, through being with. And sometimes, the only way a person learns that is by first being shattered. Not because pain is noble, but because it strips away all the distractions. It leaves only the essential. And in that barren space, something unshakable can grow. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, wrote that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. But meaning doesn't always come like a lightning strike. Sometimes it arrives slowly, like rain soaking into soil. Sometimes it's not found, but made, forged, decided, a conscious act. This happened, it hurt, and I will make something from it that is the quiet rebellion, the refusal to let pain win. And sometimes making something means simply continuing, simply staying alive. That alone is defiance. That alone is sacred. And there are those who walk among us carrying more weight than most will ever know. They don't talk about it. They don't ask for help, but they radiate a kind of gravity, a stillness, because they've known depths. They've sat with despair and not been destroyed. And that changes a person. It reorganizes their nervous system, rewrites their priorities. They no longer chase things that shimmer. They look for what is solid, what endures, and often what endures is invisible. Integrity, kindness, truth. These are the things that remain when everything else falls away. And suffering has a way of revealing them, not by giving answers, but by clearing space. Pain wipes the chalkboard clean. It erases the noise, and for a moment, however brief, the soul is quiet enough to hear what it really wants. Sometimes it wants rest. Sometimes it wants forgiveness. Sometimes it just wants to be seen. And maybe that's the deepest longing beneath all suffering, to not be alone in it, to have someone look and say, I see you. I don't need to fix you. I'm just here. Those words can heal what medicine cannot. Because humans are meaning-making creatures, and shared pain is half pain. It's why confession feels like exhale, why crying in front of someone feels like relief. It's not about solving anything, it's about being allowed to be human. And in that humanness, suffering loses some of its sharpness. It becomes something else, not sweetness, but softness, a rounded edge, a familiar weight, something that can be carried with grace. And grace too is strange. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it slips in through the cracks. Often when nothing is left, when the person has given up pretending, given up resisting, and simply sits with what is. In that stillness, something shifts, not always dramatically, but enough. Enough to take the next step, enough to see the next morning, enough to offer a smile when one wasn't possible before. That is transformation. Not the sudden kind, the slow kind, the kind that takes years, decades, lifetimes, the kind that doesn't erase the scar but makes it sacred. And maybe that's all anyone really needs, not to be free from suffering, but to be changed by it in a way that makes love easier, kindness more natural, truth more urgent. Because when someone has known pain, they know what matters and what doesn't. And that clarity, that terrible, precious clarity, is the quiet gift buried inside the grief. And yet, even as all of this wisdom settles into the marrow, even as the ideas become familiar and the metaphors resonate, suffering does not disappear. It returns, not because one has failed to learn its lessons, but because that is its nature. Like the tide, like the seasons, it rises again, sometimes softer, sometimes louder, but always there. And that is perhaps the hardest truth to accept. That healing is not a straight line. That strength does not mean immunity. That insight does not guarantee immunity from future pain. One can know everything there is to know about sorrow and still be brought to their knees by it. Still find themselves weeping in a quiet kitchen or staring blankly at a wall at 2 a.m, wondering if anything will ever feel light again. Because life does not reward wisdom with exemption. It offers, at best, perspective, a deeper understanding, a gentler descent, but the descent still happens. And that is why compassion matters so much, not just for others, but for oneself. The idea that once healing has begun, there should be no more breakdowns, no more fear, no more days of despair is a lie, a harmful one. Even the wisest have dark nights, even the most grounded are shaken. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not from peace but from war, from plague, from personal loss. His wisdom was forged in fire, and still he needed daily reminders that life is short, that pain is inevitable, that control is illusion. These were not declarations. They were lifelines, tethers back to sanity, and so it must be for all who suffer. The work is not about becoming untouchable. It is about becoming reachable, by truth, by grace, by others. Because when suffering returns, it can feel like betrayal, like all the previous healing was fake. But it wasn't. It was preparation. It was strength training, so that this time the fall wouldn't break everything, so that this time the pieces would be easier to gather, and maybe even fewer than before. Maybe something inside has already become unshakable, small but real, a still point in the spinning. And sometimes that's enough. It's what Buddhists call dukkha, the first noble truth, that life, by its nature, includes suffering. Not as punishment, not as judgment, but as fact, like gravity, like time. Dukkha is not a mistake to fix, but a condition to understand. And understanding it changes everything. It removes the surprise, it removes the blame. It replaces why me with this again. And from that shift, something like peace can grow. Not the peace of no storms, but the peace of knowing how to sail. And over time, even the storms begin to look different. Not less painful, but less personal. Less like punishment, more like weather. And like weather, they pass. Even the worst nights end. Even the deepest wounds stop bleeding. And when they do, what's left is not the same person. It never is. Every grief rewrites the script. Every sorrow rearranges the furniture of the soul. And in that rearranging, there is a choice. To resist it, or to allow it, to fight to keep things as they were, or to see what this new version of the self might need. Because that's what suffering demands, more than anything. Adaptation. Not just of routine, but of identity. And that's terrifying, but it's also sacred. To meet oneself again, freshly. To ask, who am I now after this? That question echoes. And it's not always answered quickly. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it's never fully answered. But asking it keeps the soul awake. It keeps the heart open. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the point is not to arrive at certainty, but to remain in dialogue, to keep feeling, to keep noticing. Because numbness is easy, it masquerades as strength. But real strength is the willingness to feel deeply without being consumed, to weep and still work, to ache and still care, to be wounded and still offer warmth. And that is what suffering teaches, if we let it. Not how to escape pain, but how to carry it with dignity, how to live in its shadow without losing sight of the light, and how to find, even in the darkest hour, something worth holding on to, a memory, a truth, a breath, a reason. And those reasons may be small, insultingly small. A pet waiting by the door, a plant that hasn't been watered, a friend who would miss the sound of a voice. But those small things are sacred. They are the threads that keep the soul stitched to the world. And sometimes they're enough to get through the next hour, and then the next, and slowly the hours become days, the days become months, the months become a new chapter, and the scar remains, but it doesn't sting the same. It becomes part of the landscape, a reminder, not a curse, a marker of where one has been, and what one has survived. And that survival, quiet and uncelebrated as it may be, is a kind of rebellion. Against despair, against entropy, against the lie that pain is the end. It isn't. It never was. It's a passage. And those who walk it with open eyes, trembling hands and steady breath, they are the ones who come back changed, not healed, not whole, but real. And that is everything. But what happens when the suffering stretches too long? When the pain stops feeling like a chapter and starts to feel like the whole book? When the sunrise no longer signals a new beginning, but just another loop of the same heavy breath, the same weighted limbs, the same echoing silence inside the chest? This is the moment when philosophy becomes more than an intellectual exercise. It becomes survival, because abstract ideas have no place in real despair unless they can reach down and touch the bottom, unless they can anchor a drowning mind to something solid. And that is where the ancient voices return. Not as comfort, but as witnesses. Job sitting in ashes, scraping boils off his skin with a shard of pottery, abandoned by friends, questioned by God, still breathing, still present, still aching, and Schopenhauer with his bleak smile, whispering that life is suffering, and that the only wisdom is to lessen the pain, not escape it, because escape is fantasy. The world is will, and the will is endless hunger, endless dissatisfaction, endless thirst that cannot be quenched. But once you see this clearly, something happens. The suffering stops being a mistake. It becomes structure, inevitable, like gravity. And if it's inevitable, then maybe the point isn't to fix it. Maybe the point is to endure it with eyes open, with heart open. And Camus would nod here, light a cigarette, and remind us that Sisyphus is still pushing that rock, day after day, sweat running down his back, lungs burning, and yet he imagines him happy. Not because he's deluded, not because the struggle is glamorous, but because within the absurd there is freedom. And within freedom, choice, and within choice, rebellion and rebellion is a kind of meaning. A refusal to bow, a refusal to become hollow. And in that moment, the weight is still there, but the relationship to it changes. And maybe that is the secret hidden under all the rubble. That suffering does not leave us, but our way of holding it can transform. The grip can soften, the breath can return, the hand can unclench, and it is not transcendence, it is not victory, it is not spiritual bypassing dressed in poetic language. It is survival, minute by minute, in a body that sometimes feels too heavy, in a mind that sometimes spins too fast, in a soul that sometimes begs for silence. And in that silence, something flickers. Not hope exactly, but space, and space is everything. Space to not know, space to feel rage without explanation, grief without timeline, exhaustion without guilt. And in that space, maybe something grows. Something not loud, not clear, not perfect, but real. And in a world drowning in noise and speed and polished lies, real is a treasure. And those who carry pain and still manage to love are keepers of that treasure. Quiet alchemists turning sorrow into softness, into stillness, into strength that doesn't scream. And maybe that's what all the saints and sages and broken poets were trying to say in their different languages. That the wound is not just where the light gets in, but also where the truth leaks out. That the crack is not a flaw, but a passage. That the ache is not failure, but invitation. And still, the question returns. What if none of this is enough? What if the darkness never lifts? What if the pain swallows everything? And the answer is not always comforting, because sometimes it doesn't lift, not all the way. Sometimes it hovers, low and grey for years, and that is real too, and it must be named, because pretending is its own kind of violence. And still, even there, people live, people paint, people write lullabies and grow tomatoes and laugh at bad jokes and feed cats and hold hands and watch the moon and take slow showers and brush their teeth even when they don't want to. And all of these things are sacred because they say, I am still here, even now, even in this. And maybe that is the holiest thing anyone can say. Not I am healed, not I am enlightened, not I have transcended, but simply I stayed, I endured, I kept breathing when it would have been easier not to. I folded laundry while my chest was breaking. I made tea while my world fell apart. I reached out when I wanted to disappear. I wept without needing it to mean anything profound. And slowly, over time, the soul gathers these moments, like stones, quiet, weighty, honest, and begins to build something. Not a monument, but a shelter, not a temple, but a hearth. And in that place, suffering still visits, but it no longer destroys. It no longer defines. It simply knocks at the door, sits by the fire, and is witnessed, not solved, not banished, just seen. And in being seen, something in it softens. And maybe, just maybe, in that shared silence, both guest and host are transformed. And then there comes a moment, quiet as breath, when one realizes they no longer fear the suffering in the same way they once did. It hasn't vanished, it hasn't become pleasant, but something fundamental has shifted. The reflex to run is slower now. The compulsion to fix is quieter. The ache no longer feels like an emergency, more like weather, familiar, a storm that passes through, unwelcome, but not unfamiliar. And in this new relationship with pain, something rare begins to unfold. Patience, the slow kind, the kind that does not demand resolution, that does not interrogate the moment for meaning, but simply stays, watches, allows. And in that staying, there's a kind of wisdom that can't be taught, only lived. The kind that doesn't need to speak loudly, because it knows, because it has been broken and rearranged so many times, that it no longer clings to the shape of things, only to their presence, only to their being. And this way of existing is not flashy. It does not impress strangers or sell well in the marketplace. It is subtle, invisible almost, like a tree growing in a forgotten field, unnoticed but steady, rooted, ancient, and it shows itself in the smallest of gestures. The way someone touches a shoulder without speaking, the way they pause before answering, the way they listen without interrupting. And all of these are signs of someone who has suffered deeply and learned not to rush what takes time, who has learned that not every silence needs to be filled, not every wound needs to be explained, because there is a kind of dignity in quiet endurance, and the world rarely rewards it. But those who've known real pain can see it in others instantly, like a secret language, and that recognition is its own kind of balm. Two souls nodding in a crowded room, no words exchanged, just the soft glow of mutual understanding, the shared knowledge that life can be brutal and beautiful in the same breath. And maybe that is the closest thing to truth. This blending, this paradox, this unbearable tension between sorrow and sweetness. And those who resist this paradox tend to break, tend to fracture when life refuses to be simple. But those who make room for both, who say yes to the darkness without abandoning the light, those are the ones who carry something unshakable inside them. Not happiness, not certainty, but presence. And presence is the rarest thing. It is what all the great mystics and philosophers pointed toward, even when they used different words. Presence is what remains when all illusions are stripped away, when all distractions fall silent, and suffering, for all its cruelty, has a way of forcing presence. It brings one back to the body, to the breath, to the exact texture of now. And while this return can feel violent, it is also real. And in a world that constantly tries to pull us elsewhere, into the future, into fantasy, into fear, real is revolutionary, real is enough. And those who live in this way, grounded in the real, become strange to the world. Not in appearance, but in energy. They do not rush, they do not explain, they do not defend their choices or justify their grief. They simply are. And that being is its own kind of lighthouse, steady, unshaken, and others begin to gather near it without knowing why, drawn to the calm, to the depth, to the quiet strength. And this is how suffering becomes service, not through martyrdom, not through preaching, but through embodiment, through simply living in a way that honours the pain without being defined by it. And that embodiment teaches more than any lecture could. It whispers to those still in the storm, you're not alone and you're not broken. And that whisper can save lives truly. Because when someone is drowning in pain, they don't need advice, they need presence. They need proof that survival is possible, and more than survival, that meaning, beauty, even joy can still exist on the other side of agony. Not by erasing it, but by holding it, folding it into the tapestry of life. Not as decoration, but as structure, as the thread that gives strength. And this is not poetic metaphor. This is neurological, emotional, physical. The brain rewires through repetition. The body learns safety through experience. And every time someone chooses to stay present in pain, they are teaching their nervous system something profound. I can survive this, I don't need to flee. And over time, that lesson becomes embodied, and resilience stops being a concept and becomes a felt sense, a deep knowing. And that knowing is contagious. It ripples out. It shifts families, friendships, communities. Because once a person knows how to be with pain, they are no longer afraid of others' pain. They don't need to fix or avoid or deny. They can simply be with, and that being with is the most powerful offering anyone can make. It says, I trust your process, I trust your strength. I'm not here to rescue you, I'm here to witness you. And that witnessing, that sacred presence, is what so many ache for without knowing how to ask. And suffering, when transmuted, allows us to offer that presence with honesty, with humility, and with a kind of grace that cannot be faked, only earned. And that grace, once tasted, becomes a compass, a way of living, of choosing, of relating. And though suffering may return, it no longer erases the path. It becomes part of it, a shadow that walks beside, no longer feared, no longer resisted, simply acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, something like peace is born. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of acceptance, the kind that holds everything without collapsing, and that holding, silent and strong, is what turns wounds into wisdom. And sometimes the most quietly shattering truth is that no one will ever truly understand another person's pain. Not entirely, not perfectly, not with total precision, because suffering is so deeply interior, so deeply embodied that even the best language fails. Even the closest soul can only come near, never fully enter, and that realization, for many, brings a sharp loneliness, an ache that sits beneath all other aches. The sense that this burden is mine alone to carry, no matter how much love surrounds me, no matter how many hands reach out. And yet within that loneliness there also lies a strange kind of sovereignty, a quiet ownership of experience. Because if no one else can fully feel what I feel, then this pain is mine to shape, mine to translate, mine to weave into something only I can create. And that is a kind of power, not flashy, not loud, but real. The kind of power that turns agony into art, sorrow into sculpture, grief into music, and history is full of such alchemy, of those who took their darkest nights and pressed them into the world like ink into paper, who carved their despair into verses that outlived them, who turned madness into meaning, and not because they were special, but because they were willing to feel it all, to not turn away, to not go numb. And there is something in that willingness that echoes across centuries, a signal fire for other aching souls, a whispered permission to stay with the hurt just a little longer, to see what might be waiting on the other side, of endurance. And maybe that's the real story behind so many great works of philosophy and poetry and music and religion. Not escape from suffering, but survival within it, survival through it, survival despite it, and the strange, luminous transformation that sometimes follows when the heart is cracked open wide enough for something new to grow, something unexpected, something tender and fierce and trembling with truth. And even if the world forgets, even if the crowds move on, the one who created it knows what it costs, knows what it took to bleed like that without flinching, to turn pain into beauty without losing their grip on reality. And that is holy, that is sacred, even if no one claps, even if no one sees, because the act itself is enough. The courage it took is enough. And those who've been through real suffering learn to recognize that courage in others, not by their words, but by their presence, by the way they listen, by the way they don't rush to speak, by the way they hold space for contradictions, for uncertainty, for the mess of being human. And that capacity to hold complexity is one of the deepest gifts pain can give. Because once a person has sat with their own confusion long enough, they stop needing everything to be neat. They stop needing life to be fair or tidy or logical. They begin to accept what is without collapsing. And in that acceptance, there's freedom. Not the freedom of pleasure or ease, but the freedom of non-resistance, of flowing with the river instead of fighting the current, of floating even while crying, even while breaking. And that kind of surrender isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's the kind of wisdom the Stoics pointed to when they spoke of amor fati, love of fate, not as resignation, but as alignment, as deep trust in the fabric of reality, even when it wounds, even when it burns. And that love of fate is not passive, it is fierce. It is a brave opening to whatever life brings. Not because life is always good, but because life is always real. And realness, for those who have suffered enough illusions, is the only thing that satisfies. And so the person who has walked through fire and come out changed is not necessarily happier, but they are truer, less easily deceived, more grounded, more attuned to what actually matters. And what matters is rarely what the world screams about. It is not status, not speed, not accumulation. It is connection. It is presence. It is the still point in the turning world. And those who've suffered deeply often find themselves craving simplicity, slowness, sincerity. Not because they are noble, but because their nervous system has been rewired by trauma, because their perception has been sharpened by pain, and they can no longer tolerate the false, the shallow, the hollow echo of performance. They want what is raw, what is kind, what is whole, even when it's cracked, and that longing makes them different, often isolated, sometimes misunderstood, but also luminous in a way that cannot be faked, and that luminosity is what draws others who are also hurting, who are also seeking something deeper than distraction. And in this quiet gathering of wounded truth seekers, something sacred happens, not a cure, not a fix, but a remembering, a shared recognition that we were never meant to carry this alone, that the soul, while sovereign, is also relational, that healing happens in witness, in presence, in the trembling honesty of two people saying, "Me too." And when that moment happens, the darkness doesn't disappear, but it shifts, it softens, it becomes shared, and shared suffering is a doorway, a bridge, a portal to a kind of love that doesn't ask for explanations, doesn't require masks, only presence. And in that presence there is enough light to take one more step, and then another, and before long the road is visible again. Not easy, not smooth, but real and real, for the soul that has walked through fire is always enough. And still the world turns, indifferent to who suffers and who sings. Seasons change without consulting the human heart. Winter doesn't wait for grief to resolve. Summer doesn't pause for those who are tired. Everything moves forward, always forward. And there is something both cruel and comforting in that momentum. Because when everything feels stuck inside, when the soul feels suspended in sorrow, it can be a strange relief to look outside and see the grass growing anyway, the moon waxing anyway, the birds calling to each other across wires anyway, as if to remind the silent mind that nothing ever truly stops, not even pain. And though it lingers, it also shifts, it morphs, it curls into different shapes, and in that movement there is hope, not the kind sold in books and slogans, not the clean, bright hope of new beginnings, but the quieter kind, the gritty kind, the kind that comes from knowing that nothing stays frozen forever, that even despair breathes, and with each breath comes a new texture, a new possibility. And maybe that's why so many spiritual traditions anchor themselves in the breath, in the gentle rhythm of inhale and exhale, because the breath doesn't lie. It's always now, always honest, always present. And when the mind spirals and the heart clenches, returning to that soft pulse can be a lifeline, a reminder that something is still alive, still working, still waiting to be trusted. And trust is hard, especially after pain, especially after betrayal, especially after the world has shown itself to be far more complex and far more brutal than we were led to believe. But trust doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be a declaration. It can be the smallest thing, a willingness to get out of bed, to open a window, to drink water, to send a message, and each of these is a kind of prayer, a quiet act of defiance against the voice that says it's all pointless. And that voice will come, often it's part of the terrain, part of the journey. The whisper that says, why bother when effort is made? The murmur that says you're weak when tears fall. But these voices are not truth. They are echoes, old beliefs formed in moments of powerlessness, and they can be watched without obeying. They can be heard without being followed, and this is where inner strength is forged, not in silencing the darkness, but in not being ruled by it, in learning to sit with it and still act, still care, still reach. And that reaching might not look like progress, might not feel like healing, but it is, because healing is often invisible, unphotogenic, slow and messy, and full of contradiction, and yet every moment of presence is a stitch, every honest breath is a thread, and slowly with time, a new self begins to form. Not the old self restored, but something different, something wider, more porous, more compassionate, because once someone has suffered and survived, they carry an awareness of others' pain, not just intellectually, but viscerally. And this awareness becomes a kind of sensitivity, a radar for subtle things, a tenderness that notices when someone looks away too quickly, or smiles too tightly, or says, I'm fine, in a voice that's trembling. And this noticing is sacred. This attentiveness is rare, and it can only be born from contact with the real, with the raw, with the parts of life that cannot be dressed up or numbed out. And this contact, once made, shifts everything. Priorities change, definitions of success dissolve. The craving for applause evaporates, and what matters most becomes intimacy, presence, integrity, the ability to sit with another in their mess and not flinch, to love someone not despite their wounds, but because of them, to see in their fragility the mirror of one's own. And in that mirroring, a kind of unity emerges, a sense that we are all stitched from the same cloth, all trying to navigate the same paradox, wanting to be seen and fearing exposure, wanting to be loved and fearing rejection, wanting to matter and fearing irrelevance. And yet, in the midst of these contradictions, something steady pulses, something that says, even in all this chaos, there is worth, there is meaning. Not assigned from outside, but arising from within. And that internal meaning is what no one can take away. Not loss, not failure, not death, because it is rooted in being, in the simple miracle of existence. And maybe that's what the philosophers meant, those quiet minds who wrote by candlelight while their worlds burned. Maybe they weren't trying to fix anything. Maybe they were simply documenting what it means to remain awake in a world that numbs, what it means to think deeply when everyone is skimming, what it means to stay soft in a world that rewards hardness. And that is no small thing. That is resistance, that is rebellion. And those who choose that path, even silently, even secretly, become part of a lineage, a hidden river of souls stretching back through time, connected not by creed but by courage, not by answers but by questions, and those questions matter. They matter more than most answers ever will, because they keep the heart alive, they keep the door open, they keep the light on. And in a world that often prefers certainty over wonder, choosing to remain curious is an act of great strength. Choosing to keep asking, what is true, what is beautiful, what is worth suffering for? These are not distractions, these are directions, and those who follow them may not find comfort, but they will find depth. And in that depth, something ancient and luminous waits, something that knows this life, however painful, is still sacred and always has been. And there are days, of course, when none of it seems to matter, when all the lessons dissolve into fog and all the insight becomes ash, when the body is too tired to care and the soul too quiet to speak. And those are the days when philosophy shows its real face, not as a torch but as a blanket, not as a solution but as a soft murmur in the background, reminding us that we are not the first to feel this lost, this weary, this broken, and we will not be the last, because humanity is ancient and sorrow is older than language, And still we endure. Still we ask questions. Still we reach for meaning, even in the dark, especially in the dark. And in that reaching, we become part of something larger than ourselves, something that stretches across centuries and continents and cultures, a slow unfolding of the human spirit, trying to make sense of its own suffering. And some days that sense is found in silence, in stillness, in just sitting with the weight of things and letting them be heavy without trying to lift them. And other days it's found in words, in poems scratched onto paper, in letters never sent, in books held like lifeboats, and still other days it's found in movement, in the slow rhythm of sweeping a floor, washing a dish, folding a blanket, sacred acts disguised as chores. And this is the paradox at the heart of the human condition, that the deepest truths are often the quietest, that the most profound healing happens not in grand gestures, but in small repetitions, that survival is rarely cinematic and often looks like showing up to a job that drains you or making soup when your chest is full of knives. And yet those who do this, day after day, are practicing a kind of philosophy more authentic than many who speak it aloud. They are living the truth that Schopenhauer hinted at when he said that life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. And yet here they are, still swinging, still breathing, still trying to find rhythm in the swing itself. And this act of continuing is not nothing, it is everything. And Camus would say this too, that to rebel against meaninglessness is itself a kind of meaning, that to rise without reason is to assert one's freedom. And in that freedom there is dignity, even in despair, especially in despair. And yet despair has a way of convincing us that we are alone, that no one has ever felt this particular shade of ache, but that is illusion, and one that crumbles the moment we share the truth. Because the moment someone else says, "I've felt that too," something softens, something lifts, and the walls begin to crack, and light does not flood in all at once, but it seeps, slow and golden, like dusk touching an old room. And in that light we remember that pain, while isolating, is also universal. And this contradiction is at the heart of all healing, that we are both uniquely wounded and universally connected, that our specific story is ours alone, but echoes through the lives of others like a tuning fork, and that resonance is what makes art matter, what makes friendships sacred, what makes even a stranger's eyes feel like home. And to allow that connection, to risk vulnerability again and again, is one of the bravest things a person can do, especially after being hurt. And yet it is only through such risk that life becomes full again. Not safe, but full. And fullness is not about perfection or constant joy. It is about range, about depth, about the ability to feel the whole spectrum of being without getting trapped in any one note. And that ability is not gifted, it is grown through heartbreak and endurance and curiosity and tears and therapy and silence and trying again. And the trying is everything, because effort is love in motion. And love, for all its mystery, is still the force that binds us, the thread that runs through the mess, the balm that doesn't erase the wound but makes it bearable. And those who give love in small, consistent ways, through presence, through patience, through holding space, are the philosophers we rarely write about but always remember, the ones whose names don't appear in books but whose essence shapes our lives. And maybe that's the point of all this, to become one of them, to live in such a way that even in quiet pain we offer warmth, even in confusion we offer honesty, even in weakness we offer presence, and that offering is enough, more than enough. It is everything. Because in a world that constantly screams for attention, the quiet act of attention itself becomes radical, and attention begins with the self, not in ego, but in care, in tending to the soul, like a gardener. Tend soil gently, consistently, without expecting immediate bloom, trusting that something is growing beneath the surface, something invisible but alive, and that trust becomes faith, not in any doctrine, but in process, in the slow, strange unfolding of life. And in that unfolding, we begin to see patterns, echoes, archetypes, the same stories told in different tongues. the same questions asked under different stars, and suddenly suffering no longer feels like a punishment but a passage. Not a sign of failure, but a sign of being alive, fully, vulnerably, painfully alive. And there is dignity in that, and there is power in that, and most of all, there is truth in that. And if philosophy is anything, it is a devotion to truth. Not as weapon, but as mirror. Not as rule, but as reminder. And the reminder always is this. Even in the depths, even in the silence, even when all seems lost, the self remains, flickering, breathing, enduring, waiting not for rescue, but for recognition. And the strange thing is that once this quiet recognition takes root, this slow awakening to the depth of one's own aliveness, even through sorrow, a different kind of strength begins to emerge. Not the kind praised by crowds or measured in achievements, but the kind forged in solitude, in the small choices no one sees, in the soft refusals to abandon oneself when it would be easier to shut down, to go numb, to pretend nothing matters. And this strength doesn't arrive all at once. It builds like moss on stone, slowly, patiently, almost imperceptibly, until one day it becomes part of the terrain, and the person who once trembled in the dark now walks with a quiet gravity, not because the dark is gone, but because they no longer fear it. And fear, too, transforms over time. It doesn't vanish, but it loses its bite. It becomes familiar, something recognized and welcomed like an old ache in the bones before rain. And this familiarity doesn't mean comfort. It means capacity. It means the heart has expanded to hold what once overwhelmed. And that expansion is everything. Because life will keep bringing waves, some gentle, some devastating. And the question is never how to stop the waves, but how to become a deeper vessel. How to grow the soul wide enough to hold it all without breaking. And this is not metaphor, it is neurology, it is psychology, it is physiology. The nervous system stretched and soothed over time by consistent acts of self-compassion, by moments of grounded presence, by the choice to breathe through instead of brace against. And science supports what mystics always knew, that the body is a temple of memory, that trauma is stored not just in the mind, but in the muscles, in the skin, in the breath, and that healing begins when the body feels safe enough to let go, not of the story, but of the contraction around the story, the tightness, the armor, the instinct to flinch, and that safety is cultivated in slowness, in stillness, in the gentle repetition of kindness. And this is what many philosophies miss, what many Stoic teachings risk ignoring, the role of softness, the power of gentleness, not as a weakness, but as a medicine, a necessary balance to endurance, because endurance without compassion becomes numbness. And numbness is not strength, it is absence. It is disconnection dressed in discipline. And the truly resilient are not those who never feel, but those who feel deeply and remain rooted, who weep and still walk, who crumble and still rise. And this truth has been echoed for centuries in Zen koans and desert prayers, in the poems of Rumi and the journals of Tolstoy. And the paradox remains that the more one embraces their brokenness, the less broken they become. Not because pain disappears, but because it becomes integrated, metabolized, woven into the story in a way that brings depth instead of distortion, clarity instead of confusion. And this integration is not an endpoint. It is a practice, daily, lifelong, messy, and sacred. And those who walk this path often find themselves shedding the masks they once thought were necessary. The smile that hides exhaustion, the ambition that masks emptiness, the cleverness that avoids intimacy. And in their place grows something simpler, something slower, something that doesn't need to be impressive to be true. And truth, in the end, is the only thing that satisfies, not because it fixes everything, but because it aligns everything. It creates coherence between inner and outer, between heart and hand. And this coherence is what the ancients called integrity, what the mystics called harmony, what the psychologists now call congruence, and it is felt viscerally when what we say matches what we feel and what we do matches what we value. And this alignment doesn't require perfection. It requires honesty. It requires the courage to admit when we're lost and the humility to ask for directions. Even if those directions are just a whisper from within, a faint tug in the gut, a dream that won't go away, and those whispers matter. They are not distractions, they are invitations. And every time they're ignored, something dims. And every time they are honoured, something lights up. And that light may be faint. It may flicker, but it's real. And it's enough to keep going, to keep listening, to keep returning to the truth of the moment. And moment by moment, a life is built, not from grand gestures, but from tiny acts of alignment. From the decision to show up honestly, to speak kindly, to rest without guilt, to hold another's gaze without turning away. And these acts ripple. They echo through others in ways we'll never fully know. And that too is part of the mystery, that the impact of our pain and our healing stretches far beyond what we see, that a single moment of tenderness can unravel years of silence, that a single sentence can reroute a mind on the edge, and most of the time we'll never know which sentence or which gesture it was. And that's okay, because meaning doesn't require recognition, it only requires presence, and presence is always available, not in the past or the future, but now, in this breath, in this noticing, in this listening. And when we return to this presence again and again, despite distraction, despite fatigue, despite fear, we become what the world needs most. Not perfect beings, but real ones, grounded, open, alive and awake, even through the ache. And so, the story nears its end, not with a grand answer or triumphant conclusion, but with the quiet unfolding of a truth too large to be held in any one sentence, a truth that slips through fingers when grasped too tightly, and yet lingers in the spaces between thoughts, in the stillness after tears, in the silence that follows the last note of a song that said everything without needing words, because that's how suffering speaks. It doesn't shout or demand or justify, it simply exists, deep and persistent, asking not for explanation, but for witness. And to witness without turning away is one of the rarest forms of love we can offer, to ourselves and to others. And that love doesn't look like saving or fixing. It looks like staying, like holding steady as another trembles, like remaining open when everything in the body wants to close. And this is where suffering stops being an enemy and becomes a companion. Not a pleasant one, but an honest one. One that strips away illusion and vanity and leaves only what is essential. And what is essential is rarely what we thought it was. It's not the resume or the applause or the curated images. It's not the promises made by advertisements or the fantasies fed by dreams of endless happiness. What is essential is often invisible, often subtle, often forged in the dark. Courage that doesn't announce itself, tenderness that doesn't seek credit, resilience that rises after a sleepless night without needing to prove anything to anyone. And the people who carry this kind of strength don't look different on the outside. They still laugh and doubt and worry and forget to reply to messages, but something in them is different, deeper, slower, more grounded, and that difference is felt. Not in words, but in presence. The way they listen without needing to fix, the way they hold eye contact just a little longer, the way they seem to understand even the things left unsaid. And that understanding isn't magic. It's born of suffering, of walking through their own fire and choosing not to harden. And that choice, repeated over time, becomes a way of being, a kind of quiet wisdom that doesn't come from books or degrees, but from experience, from wounds that became windows, from pain that became perspective. And these are the philosophers the world forgets to honour. Not the ones with podiums and followers, but the ones who keep showing up, keep being kind, keep believing in beauty despite everything. And they are everywhere, in hospitals and classrooms and kitchens and buses and late-night phone calls, carrying the weight of their own story while making space for others to unfold theirs. And if this series has meant anything, let it be this, that suffering, while painful, is also powerful, that it shapes the soul in ways that comfort never could, that it reveals what is false and sharpens what is true, and in a culture obsessed with optimization and efficiency, to suffer is to remember that we are not machines, we are not products, we are not problems to be solved, we are living mysteries, ever-changing, full of contradiction and complexity, and to live fully is to embrace all of it, the joy and the grief, the clarity and the confusion, the moments of light and the endless nights. And this embrace is not passive, it is active, it is a courageous act of presence in a world that constantly tries to pull us out of ourselves, and returning to the self again and again is the most radical journey there is. And on this journey, philosophy is not a luxury or a pastime, it is a lifeline, a way to anchor the soul when everything else falls apart. And the thinkers we've visited, Schopenhauer with his brutal clarity, Job with his sacred endurance, Camus with his absurd defiance, the Stoics with their elegant resolve, all of them speak to this same core truth, that pain is inevitable but not meaningless, that while we cannot always choose our suffering, we can choose our stance toward it, and that choice repeated becomes character, and character becomes destiny. Not in the grand sense of fate, but in the quiet sense of direction, of alignment, of knowing who we are when nothing else is certain. And so the next time suffering visits, and it will because it always does, maybe the question is not why me, but what now? Not how do I escape this, but how can I remain human inside it? And in that remaining, we don't just survive, we begin to illuminate, to radiate a kind of calm presence that others can feel, a steadiness that doesn't need to explain itself, a presence that says, without words, I've been there and I'm still here, and maybe that's enough, maybe that's everything, because presence heals what advice cannot, and silence, when held with love, speaks louder than solutions ever could. And if this story has touched something in you, if some part of your heart felt seen or softened or stirred, then thank you for listening. Thank you for staying through the dark. Thank you for letting these words be a companion on whatever road you're walking. And if you'd like to continue walking with us, we hope you'll like this video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because we post every single day, every night, with something new to think about, something quiet, something strange, something beautiful. And we'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what part of this story stayed with you the longest. Because while this journey is personal, it is also shared. And in that sharing, we are reminded that even in the silence, even in the stillness, even in the suffering, we are never truly alone. The story just told has now come to its close, a thread gently tied, its images and ideas already sinking into the quieter layers of thought. Yet for those whose minds still drift wakefully, another story begins, one drawn from the ancient words of Lao Tzu, the sage of the Tao, whose voice, though separated from us by centuries, still flows like a river through the valleys of time. In the Tao Te Ching, among its spare and winding verses, lies a paradox both delicate and immense, that the softest thing in the world, water, can overcome the hardest. The line is simple, almost small enough to miss, yet it holds the weight of a truth seen through long observation. Water, yielding to every shape, bending without resistance, never grasping or striking, wears down stone, slips past obstacles, finds its way where nothing else can pass. To Lao Tzu, this was not a mere observation of nature, but a mirror held to the nature of life, a lesson in patience, resilience, and the quiet strength of what does not contend. The world is full of hardness, rigid thoughts, fixed wills, walls built against change. These, like stone, seem unshakable. Yet water, soft and persistent, seeps into every crack, moves without hurry, and in time reshapes the unmovable. It wins not through force, but through its refusal to be forced. In the stillness of night, one might hear the faint trickle of a stream, or recall the sound of rain against the earth, and know in that sound the presence of something that does not fight, yet cannot be stopped. Lao Tzu's teaching is not a call to weakness, but to a strength that appears in the form of yielding, to a wisdom that sees the futility of rigid struggle, and instead flows around the obstacle, patient enough to wait for the moment when the obstacle itself is changed. Just as water is clear and without fixed form, so the mind, freed from clinging, can move through the hardness of life without breaking. This is not the strength of a clenched fist, but the strength of open hands, not the shout, but the quiet persistence that endures beyond the noise. In this way, the soft can overcome the hard, and the gentle can master the unyielding, not by defiance, but by a deeper accord with the way of things. In the landscapes Lao Tzu knew, rivers carved valleys over centuries, rain polished mountains into rounded hills, and the sea, without rising in anger, swallowed stone cliffs grain by grain. He saw in these quiet movements a way of being that did not exhaust itself in battles for control. Water never seeks to dominate the stone, yet in the patient arithmetic of time, the stone changes and the water remains. To grasp this is to see that strength does not always declare itself loudly. A rigid branch may snap in the storm, but the reed bends and survives. In human life, hardness often appears as stubborn will, the refusal to yield an inch, the insistence on victory by direct confrontation. This can win a day, a year, even a decade, but like the stone, it must eventually meet something it cannot break. Softness, by contrast, can seem like loss, like giving way, yet when it is guided by purpose, it becomes a force the hard cannot resist. To yield is not to surrender one's nature, it is to preserve it so that it may continue to act. Lao Tzu's water is not passive, for it moves ceaselessly, shaping the course of its own path. It does not cling to the bank it leaves behind, nor resist the turn ahead. It teaches that resilience is not the same as resistance, and that survival often belongs to what can transform without losing itself. In the human mind, water's way becomes a discipline of letting go, of refusing the tightness that closes off new routes, of trusting that forward movement can happen without force. It asks for trust in the unseen work of time, for faith that slow change is still change. In the candle's soft light, one can imagine the long patience of water in a world of stone, moving where there is space, waiting where there is not, knowing that nothing hard can stand forever against what flows without end. The candle gutters and steadies, the room breathing with a small hush of night air, while the mind turns again to the old pages where water is praised for going to the places others avoid. Low, quiet, unclaimed, useful to all and rival to none. Lao Tzu, a figure hovering at the edge of history, perhaps 6th century before the Common Era, perhaps later, a librarian or a recluse or a road traveller who handed a border guard the verses before vanishing, speaks through the compact brightness of the Tao Te Ching, where the highest goodness is likened to water, because it nourishes without demanding, because it does not contend, because it flows to the valley where pride does not dwell. What does it mean to go low and yet to rise? What does it mean to be soft and yet to overcome? A river answers without speech, shaping stone by patience, widening its banks not by decree but by return, again and again, until resistance becomes a curve and not a wall. The sage reads the river as others read a law code, tracing the clauses of motion in every bend, learning that timing is a deeper strength than force, that placement is a subtler power than pressure. A leader who stands above becomes a peak that the clouds pass without touching, but a leader who stands below becomes the sea, gathering all streams, directing without the roughness of command, governing by yielding, receiving by lowering, guiding by being guided. How can one be guided while guiding, and yet not lose direction? The answer moves like silt falling through clear water after the splash is done, a slow settling that reveals the riverbed again, the shape that was there all along, only hidden by turbulence. In the text, the way is not a plan, but a path already present, the current already moving. The art lies in feeling how to float within it, when to paddle, when to drift, when to slip sideways into a smaller channel that avoids the fallen tree. Water keeps no hard memory of the rock it met at dawn. It continues. It takes the next line of least resistance, not from fear, but from clarity, not from weakness, but from the recognition that the goal is distance, not drama. The body understands this teaching before the tongue can phrase it, for blood remembers its rounds, lymph makes its silent passages, tears come and go with their salt, and each breath arrives like a small tide that gathers what must be released and leaves what must remain. The mind which loves to strike can instead dissolve, letting a knot loosen by absence of pulling, letting a word emerge when it has ripened rather than when a moment demands a show of strength. What is a knot to water but a pattern that will unmake itself if soaked long enough, if left in the patient bath of attention? In the cliffside temple courtyards of memory, the rain falls for ages on bronze bells and tiled eaves, and the patina that forms is not a wound but a blessing, a softening that time writes as praise for what endures without shouting. The sage watches a torrent and a trickle and sees the same principle. That flow is invincible because it refuses to become a single hard shape, because change is not its enemy but its native tongue. Why chase confrontation when redirection will do? Why push a door inward when it will open outward for a lighter hand? Why harden a face when a pause will cool the heat and make the right sentence possible? The stone speaks only in weight, the water speaks in roots, and roots win. To live as water lives is not to resign, it is to reserve energy for what requires it. To avoid paying the cost of pride for small victories that soon become large regrets, to attend to the landscape rather than the score. The text praises emptiness, not as lack but as capacity. The cup useful because it is hollow. The room useful because it holds unfilled air. The valley rich because it receives what the mountain sheds. The sea lord of streams because it is lower than all. What is low but a promise to carry? What is empty but a promise to welcome? In the palace of strategies, this is scandalous counsel, yet history confirms it quietly, for empires that stiffen break on their own corners, while customs that bend with new times endure like reed mats renewed with each season, altered yet the same. The lesson hides in ordinary hours. A pot over flames that are too fierce cracks, a pot over steady coals cooks through. A letter sent in, anger becomes a sharp pebble in the shoe of years. A letter sent after sleep becomes a clear path, seen in morning light. A schedule packed to its lip spills. A schedule with a hollow at its centre becomes a basin that catches what chance pours in. Water does not think of winning, yet it arrives. It does not promise, yet it keeps going. It does not declare, yet it shapes. Is there a gentler power? The page closes and opens again in the mind, and the small candle offers a living commentary, for the flame achieves its task by consuming itself at a pace that does not rush, for haste would be the speed of loss, while measure is the rhythm of service. Patience is not delay for its own sake. It is alignment with what can be done now, and what must be done by hours that have not yet arrived. It is the wisdom to let time work alongside effort, so that effort is not alone. Resilience is not a helmet. It is a spring, not a wall. It is a curve that returns to form after strain. It is a way of continuing that does not require defiance to prove itself. The night listens as the thought finishes its circle. The sage remains elsewhere, or everywhere, saying almost nothing, asking whether hardness truly secures what it tries to protect, inviting the experiment of softness practiced long enough to become unanswerable. A last question ripples through the quiet. When stone is remembered centuries from now, will the memory be the crack or the curve the water left behind? And which of these tells the truer story of strength? Night settles more deeply, and the mind drifts with it, carrying the image of a river through darkness, silvered under moonlight, moving without hurry toward a destination unseen. Lao Tzu's image of water is not a metaphor invented for comfort, but an observation repeated through the centuries, a truth that belongs to the earth as much as to the text. Water is the master of adaptation. It takes the shape of the cup without argument, fills the hollow of the land without condition, and yet, over seasons and centuries, it sculpts entire continents. In the Tao Te Ching, it is written that nothing in the world is softer than water, yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard. The paradox is real because it refuses the usual meaning of strength. In the human mind, strength is often imagined as dominance, the ability to force one's will upon others or upon circumstance. But water teaches that lasting influence comes not from domination, but from endurance, from the quiet persistence that outlives the momentary blaze of force. Watch the river in flood, and you see its temporary violence, but watch it in its ordinary state, and you see its true nature, patient, unceasing, willing to travel the long road rather than claim an immediate victory. To live as water lives is to accept that the world resists the straight line. Rocks will rise, banks will narrow, fallen branches will block the way, and the impatient will turn to frustration. But water turns to finding another path. It curves where it must curve. It pauses in pools where it must rest. It even retreats when the tide draws it back, trusting that it will return again. This is not resignation. It is the wisdom of knowing that the goal is not to win today, but to keep moving for as long as there is movement to make. The sage, observing this, learns to measure time not in days or hours, but in seasons and cycles. An insult received may be answered in silence, not from weakness, but because the answer is already being shaped by patience. A setback may be met with a change in direction rather than a collision with the obstacle. To be soft in this way is to place faith in transformation rather than in confrontation. The stone, after all, is unchanged after the first drop of rain, and perhaps even after 100, but in the length of years it is worn smooth, its edges rounded, its face carved. Water has no memory for revenge, but it remembers its purpose. In the same way, the mind that flows with the Tao does not hoard bitterness or pride. It holds to its direction and allows the rest to dissolve. And there is another layer to water's strength, its humility. It seeks the lowest places. It does not rush to the heights but flows down into the valleys, into the shadowed hollows where others will not go. In this humility, it gathers all the streams, uniting them into a greater whole. The sea, said Lao Tzu, is king of the 100 streams because it lies below them. This is not the humility of self-erasure, but the humility of inclusion, the kind that creates space for others to join without fear. Those who wish to lead without force can learn here, to lead like the sea, by receiving, by making room, by letting others flow toward you rather than pushing them from behind. There is a peace in this, and a power. One can see it in the way water reflects without holding, mirrors without judgment, carries without ownership. The sky may pass across it in clouds or in stars, and water holds both images in turn, never confusing them with itself. A person who can be like this, clear enough to reflect yet calm enough not to cling, becomes as untouchable as the river's heart, for they cannot be disturbed beyond the ripples that fade in their own time. It is easy to admire the torrent, the waterfall, the dramatic rush of water over a precipice, but Lao Tzu's teaching is to admire also the unseen work of water, the slow seep into stone, the hidden flow beneath the soil, the quiet accumulation of drops that will one day wear a channel through the hardest ground. In the long night, as the candle burns lower, this truth feels close. Strength is not the clenched jaw, the raised voice, the unyielding demand. Strength is the silent shaping, the slow approach, the resilience that does not announce itself, but is found still flowing when everything else has stopped. And so the river moves on, and so should the heart. The night deepens, and the quiet becomes a vast plain, unbroken, except for the steady pulse of thought moving like a hidden stream under the surface. The mind returns to Lao Tzu's image, that nothing is softer than water, and yet it conquers the unyielding. To feel this is to see the distinction between speed and duration, between the sharpness of a moment and the depth of a lifetime. A blade can cut once and then dull. A hammer can strike and then rest. But water moves without ceasing, and its ceaselessness is its edge. The Tao Te Ching does not speak of victory in the language of battles, but in the language of seasons. It trusts what is repeated over time more than what is imposed in an instant. The heart of this wisdom is patience, not the patience of waiting passively, but the patience of acting in alignment with the rhythms of the world, knowing that resistance consumes itself faster than endurance does. The river does not push the boulder head on, for that would only exhaust its force in a single, futile moment. Instead, it slides past, finding the spaces, wearing the edges, until the stone is no longer an obstacle, but part of the path. It is a truth both simple and difficult, to remain in motion without clinging to the need to arrive, to understand that the journey is not the means to an end, but the end itself unfolding in each bend, each ripple. To live like water is to accept the shape the moment offers without becoming trapped by it. When a vessel is narrow, water becomes narrow. When a basin is wide, water spreads without resistance. In human life, this is the art of adjusting without losing essence, of bending without breaking, of being shaped by circumstance, while still carrying forward the same quiet direction. Many fear that such yielding is a kind of defeat, but it is in truth the avoidance of unnecessary loss. For what is lost in rigidity cannot be regained, but what is preserved through flexibility may be used again and again. Water also teaches humility, the choice to seek the low ground, the willingness to go where others will not go, not because it lacks ambition, but because it understands that the low ground receives all streams. This is the humility of listening more than speaking, of absorbing rather than resisting, of learning without the armor of pride. In leadership, it is the humility that unites, for those who would be followed must first make space for others to come to them. Lao Tzu saw the sea as the great master, because it lies beneath the rivers, allowing them to flow into it freely. This is a leadership without force, a gathering of strength through reception rather than through demand. In relationships, the waterway is the choice to hold without gripping, to offer space without absence, to reflect without distortion. Water mirrors the sky without keeping its image. So too can one receive the words, the emotions, the presence of another without turning them into possessions. This is a rare kind of strength, for it cannot be taken by threat nor diminished by insult. And water's lesson is not only in movement, but in stillness. A river flows, yet there are moments when it pools into deep quiet, the surface smooth as glass, holding the world's image without a sound. Such stillness is not the absence of life, but its concentration, a readiness to move again when the time is right. In the same way, there are seasons in which the wise do not press forward, but rest, gather, and deepen. Stillness allows clarity to return. It lets the silt of confusion settle so the bottom can be seen again. In the rush to act, many lose their way, but in the pause, the next step often reveals itself without effort. Water also accepts transformation without fear. It becomes vapor in the sun's warmth, mist in the morning cool, ice in the mountain shadow, and returns again to liquid without clinging to any state as final. This is the great teaching for a human life, to change form when change is needed, without resisting the return to a previous form when the time calls for it. Nothing in water says permanence is the measure of truth. Instead, it says that continuity through change is the real constant. To follow this is to be free from the terror of endings, for every ending in water is only a movement to another place, another shape, another chance to flow. And so in the deep hours, the image of water remains, soft, patient, unbroken, not because it refuses to meet what is hard, but because it knows it has no need to struggle. The hard breaks itself, the soft simply endures, and in the end, it is endurance that shapes the world. The mind drifts further into the dim corridors of thought, where the sound of water becomes not only a sound, but a presence, a reminder that all things move toward transformation. Lao Tzu's vision of water is not simply a poetic device, but a framework for living, a method of aligning with the inevitable rather than opposing it. In his teaching, the soft conquers the hard because the soft refuses the single moment of victory. It plays instead for the endless game, where time is the true ally. Stone may resist for years, even centuries, but water's persistence is a promise that cannot be broken. The lesson moves quietly into the heart. One does not have to win today to shape tomorrow. This is the art of slow triumph, the patience that outlives resistance by outlasting it. And yet, water is not only patient, it is deliberate. Every curve of a river's path is the result of countless decisions, some swift, some subtle, made by its own flowing body as it meets the contours of the world. It does not argue with the cliff, it turns. It does not curse the fallen tree, it passes beneath. It does not resent the drought, it waits in the cool earth until the rains return. To live as water is to become untroubled by the need to control the form of the path, for the path is never truly fixed. The strength is in the movement itself, in refusing to become still out of fear of change. And in this refusal, there is a deeper truth, that surrender is not always loss, and control is not always gain. By yielding, water gains access to every space. By insisting on its shape, it would lose most. In the human spirit, this becomes the practice of entering situations with openness rather than rigidity, allowing oneself to be shaped by the experience without being consumed by it. Yet water's humility hides its immense capacity for power. It may begin as a trickle, gentle enough to pass unnoticed, but with time it gathers, it swells, it becomes a current that can sweep away what once seemed immovable. This is why the sage values the low ground. There, in the place where nothing seeks to stand tall, all things eventually meet. The low ground is the meeting point of rivers, the resting place of rain, the foundation upon which the mountains drain themselves. In human life, the low ground is found in listening, in observation, in the quiet to taking in of what others offer without immediate need to respond or display. This gathering is not passive, it is preparation. For when the moment comes to act, one acts from abundance rather than emptiness. The sea is the king of streams because it lies beneath them, Lao Tzu writes. To lie beneath is to choose the position of reception rather than dominance, to let others come of their own will. This is the power of the one who does not chase but attracts, who does not demand loyalty but inspires it. And still, there is a gentleness that remains unbroken even in water's greatest force. The waves that batter the shore also carry life to it. The flood that reshapes the land leaves behind fertile soil. In the human soul, the equivalent is a firmness of principle that does not lose kindness, an ability to stand without cruelty. To be like water is to refuse the belief that one must harm to remain strong. There is also the teaching of reflection. Clear water mirrors the world without holding it, and in this, it teaches detachment. The sky's passing clouds, the moon's changing face, the faces of those who stand at the bank, all are held for a moment, then released. So should the mind hold its experiences, seen, known, and then allowed to pass without binding them to the self. This is not forgetfulness, but freedom from possession. And perhaps the most subtle teaching of water is its acceptance of cycles. It evaporates into the unseen sky, becomes cloud, returns as rain, gathers again into streams, never fearing that leaving its current form is the end. In human life, every loss is a change of form, every ending a return to another beginning. The sage does not cling to what must transform, for the same river is never the same river, yet it is always the river. The night grows deeper still, and the flow of thought becomes indistinguishable from the flow of water itself, quiet, steady, certain that it will continue long after the listener's eyes close and the dream begins. In the stillness of thought, water becomes not only an element, but a principle that reaches into the core of human conduct. Lao Tzu saw in its quiet endurance a truth that words often fail to hold. The world is not conquered by those who push hardest, but by those who cannot be pushed aside. The stone resists once, twice, perhaps 100 times, but resistance is finite. Endurance has no such limit. Water does not exhaust itself in the act of overcoming. It overcomes by continuing. And in that continuation lies a subtle form of wisdom, one that does not see victory as a single, shining moment, but as a quiet inevitability that unfolds without the noise of battle. This is why the sage learns to value time as a companion rather than an enemy. Time, like water, wears down all that is fixed and unbending, but it also nourishes all that is willing to grow. To be in harmony with time is to refuse the false urgency of forcing outcomes before they are ready, to understand that the ripest fruit will fall without effort, that the seed beneath the soil already knows its way upward. Yet water's teaching is not passivity. It moves, always moves, shaping the land, feeding the roots, carrying life from one place to another. Even when it appears still, there is movement beneath, currents invisible to the eye, but strong enough to shift the bed of the river. So it is with the inner life. The most profound transformations often occur in the depths, where no one is looking. To cultivate such depth is to live without needing the constant approval of the surface world, to find strength in the unseen work that will, in time, emerge naturally. In this, water teaches the discipline of self-containment. It does not boast of where it has been or where it will go. It simply flows toward its purpose. And purpose for water is not a fixed point but a state of being. The river does not dream of the sea, it moves toward it because that is what it is. In human terms, this is to act in accordance with one's nature, not in pursuit of an image or reward. When action is aligned with nature, there is no exhaustion from pretending, no weariness from holding a shape that is not one's own. Water's humility is another part of its strength. It does not seek the highest place but finds the lowest, not out of shame, but because the lowest place is the gathering place. There streams unite. There life thrives. Lao Tzu saw that a ruler who holds himself low becomes the meeting point for his people, and a person who lowers pride becomes a friend to all. Humility is not weakness but access. It is the opening through which all things may pass. In the way of water, pride is a dam, and humility the open channel. And water's patience is not without its moments of sudden transformation. There are times when a river swells into a flood, when the quiet accumulation becomes an unstoppable surge. In life, this is the moment when long preparation meets the right conditions, when years of quiet work produce a single, undeniable movement. The flood is not reckless. It is the release of what was already stored. And when the force is spent, water returns to stillness, without regret for its brief display of power. This is a strength rare in the world, knowing when to act with full force and when to return to the quiet flow. Water also teaches transparency. It holds no secrets for itself, yet it conceals depths to those who look without truly seeing. In its clarity, it reflects the world faithfully. In its depth, it holds mysteries. This is the balance the sage seeks: openness without vulnerability to harm, depth without the need for display. And perhaps the most comforting of water's lessons is its inevitability. It will reach the sea, whether in days or decades, whether as a river, a stream, or a cloud returning as rain. There is no doubt in its journey, only the calm certainty of arrival. For a human life, this is the trust that one's path, if walked with constancy, will arrive where it must, without the strain of forcing each step. The night listens to these truths as a sleeper listens to the rain, not needing to grasp each drop, only to feel the rhythm that has no beginning and no end. And in that rhythm, the soul finds its own reflection, soft, patient, enduring. There is an ancient scene, imagined yet true, in which Lao Tzu sits by the edge of a slow-moving stream, his robes gathered loosely, the air scented with pine, and the quiet sweetness of distant blossoms. He does not speak at first, for the water is already teaching, and he listens as one listens to an elder. The stream glides past, carrying leaves that turn in gentle spirals, their movements directed not by will, but by the unhurried certainty of the current. Here he observes what many fail to see. Water does not compete, yet nothing can rival its persistence. It does not shout, yet its voice is heard by mountains and valleys alike. It does not resist, yet its path cannot be stopped. This is not only poetry, it is instruction for the human spirit. Life often presses the mind to harden, to defend, to meet force with greater force. But Lao Tzu's water reveals that the greater mastery is in avoiding the trap of direct collision. When the path is blocked, water bends. When confined, it finds the smallest opening. When pressed downward, it gains momentum. When lifted to the sky, it waits until it can fall again. In this lies the art of transforming what is given into what is needed. The sage learns to make use of the obstacles, to see in each constraint the chance to move differently, to let the shape of the challenge guide the shape of the response. And yet, water's way is not an excuse for inaction. Its patience is active. It is a patience that never ceases to work. Even the smallest drip, allowed enough time, can pierce stone. Even the gentlest wave, given enough repetition, can alter the shape of the shore. This is a reminder that progress is not always visible in the moment, that the most enduring changes are often invisible until they are complete. The heart that adopts water's pace learns not to demand immediate results, for it understands that the present moment is only a fragment of the whole journey. The mind too can be like a river, clear when it allows thought to flow freely, muddy when it clings to what it should release. When the mind is clear, it reflects truth without distortion, like still water beneath a moonlit sky. When agitated, it loses its depth, and even the brightest light cannot be seen within it. Thus, to live like water is to cultivate a calm within, not as a withdrawal from life, but as a condition for engaging with it fully. This calm is not broken by passing storms, for storms too are part of the great cycle. They churn the surface but cannot reach the deep currents below. Lao Tzu's teachings suggest that the soul should live in those deeper currents, steady and untroubled, letting the surface do as it must. There is also a quiet nobility in the way water nourishes without seeking recognition. It gives itself to roots and seeds without claiming ownership of the growth. It refreshes the weary without asking for thanks. In this, water becomes a model for generosity, offering without expectation, aiding without claiming credit. True virtue, in Lao Tzu's vision, is like this: unseen, unrecorded, yet essential to all life. And still, the paradox remains that water's gentleness is the very source of its strength. The sword is proud of its sharpness, but it dulls. The rock boasts of its weight, but it crumbles. The fire burns brightly, but it consumes itself. Water endures because it does not insist on being what it is not. It does not oppose the truth of its own nature. In this, there is a profound invitation to self-acceptance, to live in a way that does not fight one's essence, to be shaped without losing the core of who one is. And perhaps most profound of all is water's lesson of return. No matter how far it travels, it is always on its way back to the sea, its vast home where all rivers meet. In the same way, the human spirit, through countless changes of form and place, moves toward its own vastness, its own unbroken source. There is comfort in knowing that no detour is wasted, no delay permanent. All that moves with sincerity arrives. And so the night holds this thought as the stream outside continues its endless journey, whispering to the stones, to the trees, to the one who listens in stillness, that the way forward is not in force, but in flow, not in holding on, but in letting go, not in speed, but in the certainty of return. In the quiet reach of night, the image of water deepens into a mirror for the human soul, showing that softness is not the absence of power, but its most enduring form. Lao Tzu understood this in a way that was more than metaphor. He saw it in the valleys where rivers had carved their way through ancient stone, in the delicate persistence of rain that, drop by drop, reshaped the face of the earth. The lesson was clear. What yields can also prevail. What bends can outlast what refuses to move. This truth unsettles the mind, trained to think in terms of dominance, of winning by strength alone, for it suggests that victory can be silent, almost invisible, and still absolute. The sage sees in this not a contradiction, but a deeper harmony, a reminder that power and gentleness are not enemies. To live like water is to resist the temptation to meet every challenge with direct opposition. It is to understand that the straightest line is not always the best path, that sometimes the way forward is found by flowing around the obstacle rather than breaking it apart. Water knows no impatience. It does not rush to overcome, nor does it despair when blocked. Instead, it trusts the quiet mathematics of time, the slow inevitability of its nature. And time for water is not an adversary, but a companion. In human life, this translates to an acceptance that not all things can or should be forced into the present moment, that some transformations can only be completed through the unhurried accumulation of days and seasons. Yet water is never still in its essence. Even in the calmest pool, there are movements too subtle for the eye to catch. Tiny currents shifting, life sustained below the surface. This hidden activity is a reminder that patience is not idleness, that stillness can contain its own quiet work. For the one who listens, this suggests a way of living in which effort is steady and continuous, but never frantic, where change is pursued without the strain of desperation. Water also teaches humility by seeking the lowest places, not out of shame, but because these are the gathering places, the points where streams unite. Lao Tzu knew that a person who can dwell in humility becomes a point of connection, a meeting ground for others, a source of nourishment and support. Pride stands apart and alone. Humility gathers and multiplies. In this way, lowering oneself becomes a form of strength, a way of holding more rather than less. And water's humility is not weakness, for it can rise as vapor, move with the wind, fall again as rain. It is always willing to change its form, to adapt without losing its essence. In human terms, this is the courage to let go of rigid identities, to allow oneself to be shaped by circumstances without being broken by them. Such adaptability is not a betrayal of self, but a return to the core of one's nature. For just as water is water, whether in river, cloud or snow, a person remains themselves through all transformations if they remain true to their essence. Water also holds the lesson of clarity. A clear stream reflects the sky perfectly, but when stirred by violence, it becomes opaque, its depths hidden. So too the mind, which can only reflect truth when it is calm. Anger, fear, and agitation cloud it, making even the simplest truths difficult to see. To live like water is to cultivate a mind that clears quickly, that allows disturbances to pass through without clinging to them. Such clarity is not constant perfection, it is the ability to return to transparency again and again. And in the moments when water swells into flood, when its force is suddenly visible and irresistible, it shows that gentleness does not mean weakness, that patience does not mean passivity. When the conditions are right, when the moment has ripened, water moves with unstoppable force, sweeping away what was thought immovable. The wise person too knows when to act decisively after long preparation, when to let stored potential become a single, transformative act. Yet when the surge is over, water returns to its quiet flow, without clinging to its moment of power, without seeking to preserve it. This is the rhythm of life well lived, times of stillness, times of movement, each with their place, each flowing naturally into the other. And so in the dim candlelight, the lesson of water becomes more than words. It becomes a presence, a way of breathing and being. It asks nothing, demands nothing, only invites the listener to soften, to endure, to flow, to trust that the path will lead where it must, not through force, but through the inevitability of what cannot be stopped. In this, the heart begins to understand what the mountains have always known, that even the hardest stone must one day bow to the gentlest touch, repeated without end. The moon hangs low over the still surface of a hidden lake, silver lights scattered across the ripples where a breeze has touched the water and moved on. In this quiet, Lao Tzu's thought takes shape, not as a rigid doctrine, but as something living, flowing, breathing. Water is his teacher, his metaphor, his mirror. In its patience, he sees the futility of haste. In its humility, he sees the power of yielding. And in its unbroken persistence, he sees the inevitability of transformation. The mountains believe themselves eternal, yet the streams carve their faces with patient hands. The walls built by human ambition crumble where rain seeps into their smallest cracks. Time favours the gentle, not because it is sentimental, but because gentleness works in harmony with its long cycles, never exhausting itself in the illusion of control. A person who understands this no longer measures progress in sudden victories, but in the subtle shifts that unfold quietly and without announcement. Water teaches that one need not always push forward. Sometimes it is wiser to wait, to let the terrain reveal its openings, to let gravity do the work. And yet this waiting is not the waiting of passivity. It is the waiting of a seed before spring, alive with hidden growth. Even the softest drop wears away the stone, not by force but by returning, again and again, unchanged in its intent. Lao Tzu saw that a life lived in such a way becomes unshakable. No insult can wound it deeply, for it flows past. No obstacle can hold it forever, for it finds another way. No loss can destroy it, for it knows the sea awaits at the end of every journey. This way of being is neither resistance nor surrender, but a deeper synthesis where one chooses the form of surrender that becomes its own kind of resistance. In the stillness of water, there is also a lesson about reflection. When undisturbed, it reveals what stands above it with perfect clarity. The human mind too is capable of such clarity, but only when it is allowed to settle, when the storms of emotion have been given time to pass. Clarity cannot be forced. It arrives naturally when the agitation is released. To see truly, one must learn to let the sediment of thought sink to the depths until the surface shines like a mirror. And yet water is not afraid to be stirred, for it knows the sediment will settle again. There is no fear of change in its nature, no desperate clinging to form. A river is not less itself when it becomes mist, nor when the mist becomes rain. The essence remains even as the shape shifts. This is the freedom that comes from self-knowledge, the understanding that identity is not bound to one moment, one role, one appearance. When the mind adopts this fluidity, life's transitions no longer appear as threats but as natural phases of the same unbroken current. In its giving, water teaches a final quiet truth. It nourishes without discrimination, flowing equally to the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the decayed. It asks for nothing in return. This is the highest form of generosity, one that gives not because of obligation or desire for recognition, but because giving is simply its way of being. A life shaped in this image finds its own fulfillment in the act itself, not in the reward. The candle on the low table flickers as a breath of night air slips into the room, and the listener can almost hear the voice of that ancient sage, not as a command, but as a suggestion. Be like water. Let strength be hidden within gentleness. Let movement be guided by the path that opens before you. Let your persistence be so natural that even you forget you're enduring. When the world becomes hard and unyielding, do not try to match it blow for blow. Flow into the spaces it leaves unguarded. And when joy or sorrow rise suddenly like a flood, let them pass without grasping. Return to your calm channel, to the deep and steady current that cannot be seen from the surface. In this way, the heart learns not only to survive but to prevail, not by winning but by outlasting, not by dominating but by transforming. For in the end, all things return to the sea, and the sea waits for nothing yet receives everything.